Hello, me again. Uh, Today I want to talk about productivity and why this is a challenge for Canada. Now, before we get going, we need to understand that we measure productivity in a number of different ways. And every time you change the method of measuring productivity, you get a slightly different answer. You might want to ask ChatGPT to tell you more about the different ways of measuring productivity. But there are essentially three kinds. The first is we ask how much output did each worker produce? In other words, total output divided by the number of people working. It's a very simple calculation and not very informative. Much more informative is what we call total factor productivity, where we look at three factors in particular: labour, technology, and cash, and asked what was the contribution of each of these three things to productivity. And the third way of measuring productivity is called multi-factor productivity, where we think of more things that we could also use in the equation, such as energy input costs, or the costs of physical plant, or the cost of transportation. So we look at all of these different indicators, and none of them are great for Canada. It doesn't matter how we calculate it, it's not a good story. So that's the thing I need to explain to you, and I'll do that in a set of slides. So first of all, why does this matter? Well, it's because, first of all, it shapes the wealth of the nation. Wages depend on how much revenue a worker produces as a result of their labour. We talk about how much value added they create. And so the less productive we are, the less the wages are. And our wages are roughly 30% less than the equivalent jobs in the United States, and somewhat around 10 to 15% less than many other OECD countries. So that's a problem. And you'll see that on this slide where we talk about the output per hour per worker. We are better than some, so we're a lot better than France even before the strikes and the decision to change the retirement age, which is a productivity action in itself. But total factor productivity, if you look at us, we're not as good as the United States, and it may look like a small difference, 4.8%, but it's actually very, very significant. More importantly, in every one of these other countries, productivity is slowly going up, especially in the United States. These data are for 2020, just before the pandemic. And since the pandemic, these numbers are showing significant movement. Ours hasn't. Ours has been flat for a long time. And we can see the kind of fact that we haven't yet returned to the pre-pandemic level of GDP per capita. So that's the simple measure of productivity. We aren't back to where we were before the pandemic. So why do we have this problem? Well, I'm summarizing some things I've said to you before, but the first is the very low level of investment in R&D, which is a function of our structure of our economy. Too many small firms, not enough medium and large ones. But also very poor innovation policies from federal and provincial governments, which seem to think that giving money to universities will create jobs and create wealth. No, it doesn't. The second thing is we have limited access to capital. So unlike other markets, UK for example, in the US, venture capital is somewhat constrained here and tends to invest in companies that can already demonstrate success. So there's less risk capital. And that means that we are less likely to get some sudden startups that become unicorns or narwhals and suddenly become significant players in the market. We have a few, Applied Board, Shopify rather, but they're not really examples of what the economy looks like. They're outliers rather than examples. Another critical problem is that we don't have a lot of expertise in commercializing ideas within companies. Now, what commercialization tends to mean to governments is giving universities money to commercialize intellectual property. But they're awful at that. They don't do a very good job at that. For example, we spend about 7 to 8 billion a year on research and development in our universities, and the return on that investment in terms of net return on intellectual property is less than $250 million. So we're not doing really well at that at all. Now, another set of reasons is we have very poor regulation policies, particularly interprovincial ones, but also it's overly complicated to do business here. It really is. I mean, I own several, and it's difficult to keep track of all the paperwork. If I didn't have a very efficient assistant, I couldn't manage a number of different companies. We're also very slow to adopt new and emerging technologies, even though we may have created some of them. A very good example of that is there are very few firms, manufacturing firms, making extensive use of 3D printing or rapid building design and rapid building construction using 3D printing, even though some of those developments happened here. And I've raised before the issue of our skills training and skills development. We tend to be very traditional, very staid in how we do skills development, and it's no longer really fit for purpose. Most corporations have a very short-term focus, this quarter, next quarter, this year, next year, as opposed to a longer-term focus, like 5 years from now, this is where we should be, or 10 years from now, if we do the right things, we could be here. No, we tend to have a kind of strategic mindset that's saying tomorrow is good enough, forget eventually. And finally, Canada's economy is still over-dependent on resources, wood, pulp and paper, oil and gas, other kind of core natural resources. That's not going to last forever, and we need to think about new sources of productive industry. And I think this is a major challenge, especially when I think we're not that far away from peak oil. And finally, in terms of the list of reasons why productivity is a problem, is we're not great at collaborating. You may think Canadians are nicer than Americans or the Welsh, but actually we're not very good at collaborating and doing so in rigorous ways that leads to productivity gains or innovation. We could do better, and we need to do better because DNA, as my colleague Don Simpson says, is the nature of the economy. Now, I mentioned this slide before, but I think it's very important to remember that the structure of the Canadian economy tends to get in the way of productivity gains. The more medium and large companies we have, the more likely we are to leverage innovation, technology, and systematic quality management to get higher gains in productive performance. The smaller the firm is, the less likely that is to occur. Now, what can we do to make a difference? This is your question, and you'll be looking at it in your project where you're asking this question about a particular industry your group has chosen to study. I'm going to suggest a few things for you to think about. The first is we need to think about the skill sets available to our employees. Now, Canada has a massive problem in that 40% of all of our employees have literacy levels and numeracy levels at levels 1 and 2 on a 5-point scale. And yet the majority of jobs in this country require skills at levels 3, 4, and 5. So we have a literacy deficit and a numeracy deficit, and I think we also have a digital fluency and competency deficit as well. Now, it's not just me that thinks this. The Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario studied the skills of graduates coming out of both colleges and universities in Ontario. And they found that roughly a third of those graduates from both universities and colleges had inadequate literacy skills on the same scale used by the OECD. So we need to invest in training, we need to upskill literacy, we need to upskill technology skills, and we need to get really good at being able to do that efficiently, on demand, and quickly. The second thing we need to do is invest in better infrastructure. One of the reasons we're not as productive as we could be is some of our infrastructure, particularly the grid, the electricity grid, also our telecommunications infrastructure and our energy systems are no longer fit for purpose. We have a number of bridges in this country that heavy goods vehicles pass over every day that could collapse at any minute. They're too old and need replacing. So we need to invest in better infrastructure to enable smart working. We also need smarter government, particularly in this innovation file and in the labour file and in the skills file. Some years ago, the Government of Canada asked Dominic Barton to chair a group, he was then the head of McKinsey, to chair a group looking at what we needed to do to up-game the skills agenda. And he suggested a number of things, and the government kind of did some of those things. But they will only give money to people they've always given money to. They won't give money to people that are new to this game, that have new ideas and completely new ways of working. So all that's happened is a much larger transfer of cash from the federal government to colleges and universities because they do skills. And it's the same with provinces. And yet the way colleges and universities do skills isn't good enough for the kind of economy we're moving to. We need an on-demand, fast-delivered, micro-credential driven ecosystem for skills. We need to do a lot more. We also need to stop thinking about creating yet more startups. Let's have some new companies. Let's get going with a new shop. No, let's build companies. Let's get them from small to medium and from medium to large. Sure, it's always a good idea to start up if you're passionate, but how do we help you grow a company so that within 5 years you're a narwhal, a unicorn, you're big, you're worth $1 billion? We don't have that mindset, and yet our competitors do. And lastly, we need to sort out the nature of work. We need to balance work and life so that people look forward to work and enjoy it and make a much more productive experience of being at work. We need to engage and empower workers more. And if we did that, we could increase productivity. Now, what's the consequences of not doing these things? Well, they're pretty serious. Slower economic growth, increased income inequality, growing tax and fiscal challenges for governments and for companies, more borrowing, more debt, and significant environmental challenges. If we don't get this productivity thing right, like through the energy transition or reimagining work, we're not going to win on the climate change game. The climate will beat us before we get to doing anything to fix it. And the last one is that the technology disruptions are going to be very severe. You've already seen some of the impacts of technology in things like medicine, education, law, accounting, and we've seen nothing yet. You're going to see a lot more. I took a group of your colleagues around the BMW Mini plant in Cowley in Oxfordshire a couple of years ago, and there they produce a brand new custom-built Mini every 60 seconds using robots. In fact, this factory used to employ 14,000 people in the 1970s, and it now employs 120 per shift, but it has 2,500 robots that actually produce the cars. The job of the people is to support the robots and to fix some problems that occur occasionally with incorrect welds or a wrong kind of design feature being fitted to the wrong custom-built car. So they fix and repair. They don't produce. And therefore, the productivity of that factory is phenomenal. We have the same in our plants in Oshawa and other parts of Ontario, producing terrific vehicles. I drive one of them. But we're going to see more and more disruptions in technology in all of our industry sectors from now on. So, this is a big challenge. And you need to think about this in the context of a specific industry for your project, because this stuff matters. Thanks a lot.